Well, I need to tell you about a young couple growing up in the 80s, getting married in the 80s. What a scary time to be alive. I mean, mullets on the guys, Farrah Fawcett hair with the girls, grungy clothes, reckless rock music. How did anyone survive the 80s? But for them, something much scarier happened. See, this couple, when they got married, they were devout atheists. They thought Christians at best were delusional, crazy at worst, and then something shortly after their marriage, terrible happened. The wife joined a Bible study. She was studying the Bible. She shortly after started going to church, and her husband was devastated. Thought they had committed to never do this, to never live this way, and here they are stuck with one of them going to church. However, he loved his wife. He loved his wife so much that he had sent him on a journey using his skills and education as an investigative journalist to prove to his wife that Christianity was false and that she should stop going to church. And it's with that thought that I bring us to our series in Matthew. We've made it to chapter 11, and today we see a minor character in the book of Matthew step up to take a major role. His name's John the Baptist. Now, he's the one set to prepare the way for Jesus, but in Matthew's gospel, in Matthew's story about Jesus, little's been said about John the Baptist. He popped up, talking about the baptism of Jesus and kind of preparing right then. And then we see really briefly in just one verse that John the Baptist was arrested. And that's it. Other gospels, the other three gospels highlight John the Baptist much more. Mark and John's gospels spend a great deal of time setting up that John the Baptist is the one preparing the way for Jesus. But Luke, by far, says the most. He goes back to the miraculous events that led to the birth of John the Baptist, even Jesus and John the Baptist meeting each other, both while in the womb. And all of this, in Matthew's biography about Jesus, changes today. Matthew has John take center stage in a lesson that teaches us how to come to Jesus. Pray as we get started. Our Father in heaven, give us eyes to see your reign on earth as it is in heaven. Build in our hearts today the courage to come to you with our biggest questions. Pour through me the gift of preaching that the desire for Christ's kingdom would grow in our hearts. It's in Jesus' name that I pray this. Amen. Okay, now before I start reading here, it's helpful to know the background of what's going on. If you remember back to Christmas, can you guys remember back then? we learned that Herod the Great quickly went after Jesus as a toddler, trying to have Jesus executed. So Jesus fled to Egypt, but then remember Jesus came back to Israel, specifically the region of Judea, and they found out not all is well. Okay, so when Herod the Great died, his kingdom was split. The region of Judea, where modern-day Jerusalem is, and the Gaza Strip and all that, that was ruled by Archelaus, okay, his son. And if you remember early when we were reading about this, that even Herod the Great's son Archelaus was a threat. So Jesus had to go north. Mary and Joseph took him north, up into the region of Galilee. This was a safer region in the small town of Nazareth for Jesus to grow up. Now Herod's son, who took over there, was Herod Antipas. And what you need to know for the story today is that Herod Antipas was a creep. Okay? A creepy creep. He decided that he liked his brother's wife, had an affair with her, and married his brother's wife. This does not sit well with John the Baptist, because John the Baptist thinks, like any good Jew would, but especially as a prophet, that this guy should be pure. He should be a good guy. The king of the Jews should not be doing such detestable acts. So John the Baptist does what prophets do. He opens his big mouth. He calls out publicly Herod Antipas, which promptly lands him in jail. These jails were rough. It wasn't 3 square meals a day like we talk about with our modern prison system. You had to rely on family and friends to take care of you. Probably his disciples were the ones bringing food to him, checking in on him, looking after him. And he's struggling. And while in jail with one of these meetings, he has an important, pressing question. So he tells it to his disciples, who then bring this question to Jesus. Pick up on this with me. After Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, he went on from there to teach and preach in the towns of Galilee. When John was in prison, hearing about the deeds of the Messiah, he sent his disciples to ask him, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else?" The words seem almost inconceivable. John the Baptist has doubts about Jesus. How can this be? John is the Robin. Jesus is the Batman. They're supposed to be sidekicks together. John's supposed to have this unrelenting, unwavering support. And now John is sending a message to Jesus like, "Are you really the Messiah? What is happening here? Why did Matthew include this story? It seems embarrassing." And I think this is particularly embarrassing for us to talk about at church because doubt is a taboo word to say at church. Why would you say doubt? See, doubt is often seen by us as the opposite of faith. And John, when he's wondering if Jesus is the Messiah, seems to be saying, "I doubt it. I doubt it." And we've been reading about all these miracles for the past few weeks in Matthew's Gospel. The unfathomable miracles, breaking the laws of science. And it might leave some of us at times in the pews quietly saying to ourselves, "I doubt." And yet when John doubts, he gives us a clearer clue about doubt. Do you notice when John doubts? When he's suffering. Isn't that when our largest questions seem to come? In our hurts, in our pains, in our brokenness of life, we have doubts that come to the surface. We cry out, "Where are you, God?" We ask, "Do you see my suffering, my pain? Are you going to do something about this situation?" And here is a hard question for faith. Is our faith reliant on our circumstances? Or can our faith endure imprisonments that life brings us? But we also need to notice the core question of what John is asking here. See, modern day questions that we typically ask or think of when we talk about doubt are like things like suffering in the world, injustice, why do bad things happen to good people, science versus faith, Jesus versus other religions. And those are good questions to ask, and it's important to seek answers to those. However, John's question is different, and actually, I think it's much more relatable. John is asking, "Are you the long-awaited king? Are you really the Messiah that's to come? Or is that coming afterwards?" You see, Jesus' kingdom wasn't meeting John's expectations for the Messiah. John was a prophet. Prophets were known for being outspoken for calling out injustice in the world and calling out leaders and calling for new, better leadership. John was expecting Jesus to fight against the injustice, to stand up against the Herods, to stand up against Rome, the Jewish leaders. And this, at this point, doesn't seem to be happening to John. In other words, Jesus isn't working the way John expected and in the time frame John expected.
Does this sound familiar to anyone else in your life? Now, you're probably a stronger Christian than me, but I just have to tell you that sometimes in my life, I get frustrated because God doesn't seem to be working on my time frame. Sometimes I want to give God a Yelp review that says slow service, right? Like, what are we doing here? Furthermore, sometimes when I turn the pages of the Bible, Jesus doesn't seem to be the Jesus I want him to be. And I think I'm not alone in this, because all too often I hear people complaining about Jesus. They say things like, Jesus is too conservative, or Jesus is too liberal, too outspoken, or too quiet. He's considered to be too legalistic or too graceful. The more recent question we ask is Jesus too white, or is Jesus too brown? Too aggressive or too meek? Oftentimes, Jesus isn't what we expected, and in that time, we can ask, what's wrong with Jesus? Or we can ask a harder question. Why am I upset with Jesus? Why does this Jesus not fit what I'm looking for? And now I've been pretty hard on John the Baptist up to this point. But John the Baptist does something right here. Do you notice who John the Baptist takes his questions to? Jesus! I've got a question. Let me go to Jesus with my question. What can we be tempted to do when we have doubts? Oh, we can get so cynical, right? We can get so angry or bitter or negative, and then the grumbling can start to come out. And we start talking to other people at church, our family, our peers. I don't know about this, Jesus. I just doubt it. I just doubt these things are happening. However, there's healthier ways to deal with our questions too, right? Studying together at church. Our Bible study time is a helpful way to work through these things. I hope you know that the elders and I, one of the roles we play is to sit down and talk with you if you have questions about your faith. I hope that you have personal times of study where you might have faith questions and you work through those things and you seek answers to your doubts. But most importantly, hear that you have access to God to bring your greatest questions. If you don't think God can handle your greatest questions, read the Psalms. And then you'll go, ooh, they asked some really embarrassing things about God. Right? We have 24/7, 365 days access to God in prayer. It's better than Wi-Fi, it's better than text messaging, and way better than email. Don't get me started on post office stamps either. Okay, we can reach out to God in prayer. And that's what we're to see here. Now, sometimes the questions do take a while to get answered. I think it took a while for this message to get relayed back to John. Now, Jesus is going to respond back to this, and we need to understand that the context of this is Jesus is speaking publicly. He's giving a public teaching time. Everyone can see him. And so Jesus isn't just going to come out and say, yeah, tell John I'm the king. No. Jesus would quickly become executed if he did that, and he's going to delay that for a little while, spoiler alert, okay? The other concept for us to grasp is a theological term called the messianic secret, okay? So in times in all the Gospels, it's really important to notice when Jesus is in public or in private. And a lot of the miracles take place in private. He says things or he teaches the disciples in private, and he even tells people after he heals them, don't tell anyone, which seems kind of weird, right? Because we're used to modern day politicians. What do modern day politicians do? They get behind a microphone and they're like, I'm the best thing since sliced bread. Look, I invented the internet, or whatever Al Gore says he did. You know, those kind of things. And Jesus does something different. Jesus wants everyone to come to the conclusion of who he is individually. What Jesus did do, is doing, and will always be doing is allowing people to make their own decision about Jesus. Everyone must decide for themselves if Jesus is either liar, lunatic, or Lord. And Jesus gives everyone space to work through this question on their own time frame. Now, knowing this, take a look with me how Jesus responds to this question. Jesus replied, "Go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the good news is proclaimed to the poor. Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me." Jesus responds with a coded response, a secret response. Jesus responds by quoting pieces of Isaiah 26, 28, and 35. These prophecies of the coming Messiah were written down hundreds of years before Jesus arrives, and Jesus is performing these miracles. And in one sense, it gives me goosebumps just to think about it. Well, look at what you see in here. Is this not fulfilling the prophecy? It is so exciting. Surely John was encouraged by this answer. Here is the Messiah. But in another sense, John's left with questions. Questions because Jesus didn't quote the prophecies about judgment and dominion. Why are those missing here? On top of this, the order of Jesus doing things is strange to John. The mercy, the healing, the grace that came before overthrowing the evil forces and the rulers of this world left John with a lot to ponder in that prison cell. Now, as we continue, Jesus is going to go on with a little mini sermon here, and he's going to pay tribute to John's legacy and solidify his status as the one preparing the way for the Messiah. So watch carefully to verse 7 that Jesus is preaching where Herod Antipas is king. Again, he must choose his words carefully or else he'll end up in that prison cell with John. But Jesus is waiting for just the right time and the right place to confront the leaders of this world directly. And as we continue on in Matthew, we'll see that. But for now, hear this. As John's disciples were leaving, Jesus began to speak to the crowd about John. "What did you go out in the wilderness to see? A reed swaying in the wind? If not, what did you go out to see? A man dressed in fine clothes? No, those who wear fine clothes are in the king's palaces. Then what did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. This is the one about whom it is written, I will send my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way before you. Truly I tell you, among those born of women, there has not risen anyone greater than John the Baptist. Yet whoever is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has been subjected to violence, and violent people have been raiding it. For all the prophets and all the law prophesied until John, and if you are willing to accept it, he is the Elijah who was to come. Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. To what can I compare this generation? They are like children sitting in the marketplaces and calling out to others. We played the pipe for you and you did not dance. We sang the dirge and you did not mourn. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they said he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say he is a glutton and a drunkard and a friend of tax collectors and sinners. But wisdom is proven right by her deeds. So John's disciples are walking away, and they hear the most comforting words about John. Jesus rapid fires 6 questions with metaphors that seem a little strange to us. The first is the wilderness. Why'd they go out to the wilderness to see John the Baptist? Well, the wilderness is the place where God creates Exodus, where he leads people to freedom. Now, reeds swaying in the wind were common in that time, but reeds were the image that Herod Antipas used on his coins as money. We've got a picture of them here of what they looked like. You can see the reeds there swaying in the wind. And then there's this indictment on clothing and food. John was out in the wilderness wearing camel's clothing and eating bugs and locusts and that sort of thing. And then he's like, oh, well, if you wanted to see something nice and you wanted to see soft clothes, go out to the wilderness. Or go to the palaces and you'll see those things. Jesus is subversively here calling out Herod. And so Jesus goes on to quote directly that Malachi chapter 3. He's saying that John the Baptist was more than a prophet. He was the one who came to prepare the way for the prophets. And all the prophets and all the law built up the Old Testament to this point of John the Baptist. And now John is the last of them and something new has started. But then there's a really weird, bizarre line. I don't know if you've caught this. It's a crazy one. Whoever is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than John the Baptist. I'm adding that one to my resume. I don't know about you. And greater than John the Baptist. And it'd go real well in the elders meeting, right? What I'm saying here is that John was the greatest of preparing the way. But God's kingdom is now breaking through. The status is not in ability. It's that we can be greater than John the Baptist, not because of anything that we have done, but we came after the time of fulfillment. We came after the coming of Jesus. And then it continues on to a generational statement. You know, generations love to poke fun at different generations, especially baby boomers and millennials shooting shots back and forth at each other as they make fun of each other. And Jesus kind of sounds like a grumpy old man here. Like, what do I say about this generation? Get off my lawn, by the way. But Jesus is actually making an indictment on their cynical, skeptical doubt. He quotes here a nursery rhyme of sorts about child's play. Now, Aubrey and I try our best to play with our kids. Right now we play a lot of babies and Pokemon. Can let you guess which one aligns with which there. And the best Aubrey and I play to our abilities, we're trying to understand their imagination, their play world. And at some point we aren't meeting their expectations of how we're playing. And so we get kicked out of it. We get some grumbling and we get some playing. And then maybe some of you teachers out there have had the times where you've noticed, or parents you've noticed with your kids, that the way they're playing with each other isn't meeting each other's expectations. So they're fighting with each other about how they're playing with all these toys and getting along. That's what Jesus is calling this generation. Childish. Childish. And then he even gets more specific. Because they have Jesus. And they're still saying, I doubt this is the real Jesus. So they're mad at Jesus. They're mad because they say Jesus eats too much and spends too much time with sinful people. But they were also mad at John the Baptist because John the Baptist was too holy and he had a really weird diet of locusts and honey, and they just can't have it right. Clearly their parents never read Goldilocks to them, Goldilocks at least at some point got content. The porridge might have been too hot or too cold, but she found something that's just right. And Jesus is like about to pull his hair out. What are you going to find that is just right? But wisdom is shown by her deeds. So this all leads to the big question of the day. Do we have ears to hear and the eyes to see what Jesus is really like? And are we okay with Jesus not being all we imagine Jesus to be? Because Jesus is saying, the proof's in the pudding. Look at what I've done, right? Wisdom in Jesus' day, and you see this in the book of Proverbs too, is considered a feminine trait. We know this to be true in our lives. That's why women generally live longer than men, because men, we do things like, it usually starts with a sentence like, I bet you I can jump over, through, in, above, below, whatever. And we have shorter lifespans because of it. And all the while, the women are sitting back, wisely laughing at us, and as we prove our stupidity. But Jesus, throughout chapter 11, is proving himself, and even before this, through the miracles, by his actions. Look at what he is doing. Judge me by my actions. And he's trying to get John and everyone else to hear that this is the point. Now, Jesus at this point has not fulfilled all the prophecies about him, and not in the order he expected, but Jesus' actions prove he has fulfilled some of the messianic prophecies about him. And it's frustrating because Matthew doesn't tell us how John felt when he received this news back. How he received it. I think John had a lot of time to process it. If you haven't seen it yet, season 4, episode 1 of The Chosen is all about John the Baptist's life. I cried watching it. Incredible episode about John the Baptist. But here's what happened in the start of Matthew chapter 14. Matthew wants us to see just how disgusting Herod Antipas was. In contrast of the kingdom of heaven versus God's kingdom is the contrast that Matthew is trying to point out here. Herod is having a party, a drunken party, and in the midst of the craziness, Herod's wife's daughter gets up to dance. This is the wife who was his brother's wife, and this is not a cute little dance recital. This is a seductive, erotic dance that is to seduce the king into giving this girl, who is his niece, by the way, whatever he wants. So he says after this dance, "What do you want?" You think about all the different things you could pick with a question like that. Money, status symbols, chariot, whatever. She's like, how about John the Baptist's head on a platter? Creepy? Weird? It's a contrast reminding us to be weary of these people. These leaders in the world who are so easily persuaded by sexual desires. But it's also the end of John. And so, as John was sitting in his prison cell that night, in the evening, maybe ready to go to sleep, maybe asleep already, as they grab him, as they pull him over to be executed, I wonder what he thought. I mean, I tend to think he was living by faith, that he had faith that not all of his questions had been answered, but some of them had been answered. But as he laid there waiting to be beheaded, think about this. On this side of the grave, John never got to see Jesus riding in to Jerusalem as king. As the crowd shouted, Hosea, or Hosanna, Hosanna. John never got to witness Jesus going into the temple and calling out all the leaders of the world. John never got to see Jesus being raised up, a crown placed on his head, a sign saying, this is the King of the Jews. John didn't get to see Jesus face off with the ultimate powers of sin and death. And John, on this side of the grave, didn't get to witness Jesus walking out of that tomb, becoming king of all creation. John the Baptist just had to live with questions. Questions about Jesus, and in faith believe that Jesus is the Messiah. What do you think, church? Can you do the same thing? With this in mind, let me just say briefly just a few things about doubt and faith. You know, it's so easy in life to run from our doubts, to bury our doubts, to hide from them, to say Hakuna Matata to our doubts. You guys didn't get the Lion King reference there. Instead, I hope we can see that there is a version of doubt, this healthy, sincere doubt, that is in fact the germination process for faith. The seeds of doubt, when sowed and planted, often are watered by the Holy Spirit. The sun causes the light to shine upon them, and faith sprouts out of the seeds of doubt. This quote gets at the heart of what I'm saying about doubt. Faith is the courage that conquers doubt, not by removing it, but by taking it as an element into itself. When I talk with people who have faith questions, they're taking that as a time of encouragement for me. They are seeking, they are looking, they are on this journey to find God. That is a good sign. The ones who worry me more are the ones that are just too busy, that won't seek answers to the questions, that seem to already have all of life figured out, that just continue on with life and don't give Jesus the time of day. But let me say, on this side of the grave, I believe we will always have doubts. It will always come down to faith. We will always have to make a decision in faith about Jesus. And over the course of following Jesus in my life, I can attest to this, and maybe some of you more so as well, that in a lifetime of following Jesus, some questions get answered. Some questions lead to new questions. When we're looking for the answers to some questions, we find the answers to other questions, and then new questions grow out of that. And I don't know why God works this way. But my hunch is that in the course of our seeking and finding, we grow closer to God. That's where God always wants us to be. The divine mystery that is God and humanity in relationship with each other, loving one another, is where I think God's trying to bring us all. So let me bring you back to the start of my sermon. This investigative journalist kept chasing down his doubts, and the more he was seeking, the more he was finding. He found out what all of us husbands end up to find out one day. His wife was right. Right. Lady wisdom prevailed once again. The man I tell you about is Lee Strobel. His investigation on doubts led him to write probably the most famous book about coming to faith in our modern age, The Case for Christianity. The dude's had a movie made about him, okay? His questions and his doubts ultimately led him to Jesus. And so I want to leave you today with verse 6 of Matthew chapter 11. Jesus adds a beatitude. Remember, beatitudes are blessings. These are the blessings that Jesus uses to start out the Sermon on the Mount. And they don't seem like blessings when you go through these beatitudes. They don't seem like people who are normally blessed. But Jesus, in the course of what happens with John's questioning, adds a new beatitude. Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me. We have questions about Jesus. And the temptation is always to try to make Jesus into who we want Jesus to be. But the blessing is to not let this trip us up. And instead to allow Jesus to be Jesus. And to allow Jesus to transform us into his image instead of the other way around. Because we were always created to be in his image, and it seems to work better that way. So as we close, when all those false Jesuses start popping up in the world, when you start to feel those false Jesuses in your heart, can you say to those Jesuses, I doubt it.